Hey guys, welcome back. Excuse the very congested sounds I've got going on right now. I have a little bit of a cold, but wanted to just give another video update on how we're doing. I'd like to take the format of the videos in a little different direction. I would like to kind of do more of a narrative style as I'm going through the different things that we have to fix and repair. Show a clip of something that I'm working on, talk a little bit about it, maybe some of the troubles that I went through. I know there are other different channels that do something similar to that. I think it's a little bit more enjoyable. I know sometimes it gets boring just watching time lapses over and over again, so I want to see how this format works. In this episode, we installed the valve assembly back on top of the cylinders. I actually had to install it, take it off, and then reinstall it. You'll see more on that in the video today. And then in the next episode, I finish up the top end. However, there's a part that I broke over here. Actually, I didn't break it. It just was broken. It was torn, actually. It's like a gasket. I can show some pictures in the next episode. But I've got it covered up right now, guys. I don't want to spoil everything. That way you can watch it in real time. But this episode is full of headaches, and yet realizing that it was probably a good thing that this accident that I did have happened, and you'll see more on that. Like I said, I'm going to try and go away from the time lapses for certain parts because I think the discussion and talking about what's going on is more important. I know that's what I like in videos. So anyway, I hope you enjoy the new format and the new style, and let's get to it. In this episode, we will be installing the valve assembly back onto the top of the engine. Looking at this gasket after the fact, it's a lot simpler than I made it out to be. Look for the indicator tabs, where the alignment dowels fit through, and that should save you a lot of time. Also, try not to force it down over like I did in some of these clips. Take your time and lay it over the posts evenly, or you might damage things. After the gasket goes on, the valve assembly can go on with a few taps of a rubber mallet. When doing this, you'll notice I position the valve assembly very precariously in my one hand. Definitely not a good idea. I'd recommend instead making the zip tie train that I have a lot longer and threading it through way beforehand. The next thing to do is insert the cam chain tensioner. Be careful to make sure you give the tensioner all the slack it has available, or getting the cam sprockets and chain on will be basically impossible. Each model varies, so make sure you just follow the instructions for yours. Also, make sure the locating dowels are either on the tensioner or in the valve assembly already. Before inserting, also make sure the chain guides are put in place and secured with retaining pins. More on this later. Also, make sure to remove the whole assembly because you forgot to feed the chain around it. There is a guide on my cam tensioner setup which also slides into a slot in the valve assembly, so it has to be inserted as one piece and slid into place. For good measure, make sure you don't read the instructions the whole way through and take everything back out again, only to confuse yourself even more. We're going to fast forward a bit to where I'm attempting to install the retaining pins on the one cam guide chain. This is learning moment number 512. Always stuff paper towels into any open holes inside the engine compartment. The last thing you want is what happened to me, which is the small retaining pin falling down into the engine assembly. This was definitely a big oof. The next few clips are of me trying and failing to find the retaining clip with a flashlight, pick, and magnet. I knew the only thing I could do at this point is somehow turn the engine over and remove the oil pan and look in that area. Remember, when doing this type of work, keep a level head and try not to come up with the solution right away. It never works out in your favor. In hindsight, it was probably not the smartest idea to sit the engine on this angle to try and get to the oil pan. I should have just tipped it over completely from the start. Also, always be willing to call for backup. Hi, I think I messed up with the Honda bike. It was at this point I realized this engine needs to flip over if I ever want this thing out of here. Remember, lift with your lower back and your wrists, not your legs like you're supposed to do. This will ensure you live a long and healthy life. A couple whacks with the rubber mallet and the oil cover was off. Looking back at this was probably a blessing in disguise. If you can see that oil pickup for the pump, it is totally crusty and gunked up with old oil. This got a good cleaning later. The hunt then began to try and see if I could find any trace of that retaining clip. By some stroke of genius, it had fallen all the way through and missed everything inside the engine and gotten into the oil pan. I originally couldn't see it because of all the oil sitting in the pan, but found it when I was straining it with a magnet. By the way, this was no longer black or brown oil, but some disgusting green color. Next up was using a very mild abrasive, something like 220 grit, brush wheel to clean off the gasket surface. I had recalled that the gasket kit I purchased came with one for the oil pan, so that was a relief. Single replacement gaskets for this engine run about $20 on eBay, where some people laser cut them with an old profile they may have. This surface then gets tidied up with a razor blade. I've gotten pretty good at doing this from all the work I've done on various cars and trucks over the years. Here's a quick shot of that pickup screen that I cleaned all up. I think it took almost an entire can of brake cleaner. After getting everything cleaned up and the surface wiped down with brake cleaner, the oil pan gasket goes on, followed by the oil pan. Then, all the bolts get put in and torqued down to spec. It really helps to take pictures of these setups to make sure all the brackets go back in on the same direction. Then, it's back over to the other side of the engine. I decided to take the valve assembly gasket back off since some of the assembly lube and oil drained down onto the surfaces of it. I cleaned that and the gasket back up, and back on they went. Next came the valve assembly again, with a slightly better, but still difficult, threading of the chain through the assembly. A couple of whacks with the hammer and it should be okay to go. Back to this silly tensioner. Notice my fantastic use of paper towels to cover up the holes in case anything falls in again. The bolt caps for the cam tensioner then get hand tightened for now. I hate working on projects when they call for random parts that I may or may not have. For instance, the valve assembly studs call for this molybdenum disulfide grease. If you're not familiar with that and you Google it, you'll probably get my Reddit question asking, what the heck even is this stuff? Some bolts and nuts like to get torqued down with an assembly grease or lube of sorts for proper torquing. I had to run out to the store and go grab some. I then hand tighten all the bolts down and get ready to tighten all of them down in a crisscross pattern according to the manual. A couple of these bolt caps show up on the outside of the engine and I want them to look nice and new and shiny. So I make sure to clean them all up on a wire wheel and then polish them on a polishing wheel. Back to the engine and the bolts start to get torqued down in that crisscross pattern we talked about before. After torquing these down, an oil pipe gets prepped and installed on the back of the valve assembly and top of the crankcase. Make sure whenever you do this that you are positive the bolts you are using are the correct ones. I know these as banjo bolts. Not really sure why, but that's just what I've always called them. But they have a hole through them to allow oil to pass through and into these pipes. You don't want to install the wrong bolt, otherwise you might have some blockage. These bolts then all get torqued down to spec. If you're ever doing this yourself, there is a silver bolt which goes in the centerpiece right here, which services, it looks like, the starter, and then there's a much larger diameter bolt down here. The two standard size remember these are all banjo bolts, so they're all going to have holes in them. There should be an oil ring, oil plate, what do they call them? Oil washer on either side of all these fittings. Make sure you just tighten them all down equally. You may have to pull this one down in so that it pulls the whole oil rail this way so that this connection fits. So I just wanted to share that with you. And that does it for this episode. Overall, I think this took about 3 or 4 days to do, mainly because of the delays associated with losing that retaining clip. But all in all, it was probably a good reminder for me to make sure I take my time with parts, as well as let me clean out that gunky bottom end of the engine. That'll do it until next episode, where we install the camshafts, cam sprockets, and internal oil lines. I'll see you then.